Hey everyone, today's interview is about the real estate market. It's about life sciences. It's about how everything is changing, and it feels like a very different conversation today than it did the last time my guests were on. So if you are a life sciences CEO, if you're going, well, what does the market look like right now? Should I be putting up roots? Should I be considering options? How do I choose options? Today's the conversation that you want to listen to. Our guests today have been guests before. They are advisors and exclusively help tenants navigate the commercial real estate process from strategy through move-in and beyond. They are with Tactics Real Estate. Well, they're Tactics Real Estate advisors. And our guests today are Gary Lozoff and Dan Ritterman. Dan is kind enough to have put himself on mute because apparently he was worried that anything would happen. But I have to say that we did discover that Gary has probably one of the most interesting ringtones
That's true. That's true.
It rang, and both Dan and I were looking for the dog because that's what we thought was out there. But that does tell you how Gary represents his clients like a bulldog. So that's what we're listening in for. Our guest today, Gary Lozoff, Dan Ritterman, we've had them both on before. It's a super fun conversation. This is the DarshanTalks Podcast, or DarshanTalks live stream. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. I would appreciate it if you would ask our guests questions. Please leave a comment, please subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share. It helps with the YouTube algorithm. You can always reach me on Twitter at DarshanTalks. Go to my website, DarshanTalks.com. You can actually also find Dan at D. Ritterman at tactics.com, or you can find Gary at G. Lozoff at tactics.com. Hey guys, how are you guys today?
Doing great. I'm smiling.
Darshan. Thanks for having us. We appreciate it as always.
I'm smiling, Darshan, because as you know, we just recently came off the Roland Garros French Open Championships, and we were listening to the dog bark on my ring, and I was thinking about what rings Philippe Chatrier Court in both French and English, and that the phrase is "victory goes to the most tenacious," and I think that we are in a moment in time when passionate, focused advocacy can make a real difference. And Dan and I are going to discuss some truths affecting the commercial real estate process for life sciences users, and in particular pharma users today. And I think that mantra obtains in a big way outside the lines as well as within the lines at Philippe Chatrier.
So I will admit I don't follow the U.S. Open as closely, so I am so lost in this conversation. It's not even funny. So, but I appreciate you dropping knowledge. Like I look like the type of person who would.
It's one of the elite global tennis events.
I'm actually big to the U.S. Open. I just don't follow it.
Yeah.
But it was a birthday gift my brother gave me several years ago. It was completely wasted on me because
nice.
I'm a fighter, so I used to. I was U.S. number 2, India number 3 in judo. So that's my sport. That's all
I'll remember to Google that later.
Fair enough. But it brings us to our conversation, right? It brings us to the conversation of representing your clients with zeal. It's what I do as a lawyer. It's what you guys do as advisors, as representatives of tenants. But today's conversation is going to be about the 4 truths in commercial real estate for life sciences companies. And I'm really excited to hear what you guys have. So Gary, we're going to do this like David Letterman does. So we're going to do the countdown. So what is number 4?
Number 4, your project will take longer and cost more than you think.
That seems like something everyone's told me about listening to your contractor. It will take longer. It will cost more. They always use the 10% number. How accurate is that?
Well, it's interesting because construction costs, both on the labor and the material side, are continuing to cascade and increase at rates that are almost irrational. the three of us were speaking earlier before about a deal that I recently completed for a biotech company called BioMeat, their new headquarters space at 401 North Broad in Philadelphia. That they moved into that space in January of this year, right? And those construction commitments were made in the first quarter of 2021. Had that contract come up in this cycle right now, those costs would have been at least 15% higher.
Wow.
A year later.
So, but one might say that's almost covered by inflation. So isn't that completely in line with what you'd expect?
Well, yeah, that's a great point. You're right. We're in a moment of hyperinflation, but these cost increases were spiraling in this way before this very, very recent craziness began with inflation generally in the economy. And my sense is that because of those underlying inflation inflators, if you will, the pricing would be even more than the 15 to 20% right now. But I'm just grateful for these folks, for my BioMeme team, that they're not out there rebidding this contract now. In terms of timeline, Darshan, another real terror dome situation, particularly with technical builds for pharma users and life sciences users, where there are extraordinary power requirements, ventilation requirements, very, very purpose-built FF&E generally. We're talking about timeline between order and install of up to a year for a lot of that equipment right now and those fixtures now, because of supply chain problems that are afflicting the economy generally, but very specifically affecting that industry.
I mean, anecdotally, we were recently told that a rooftop HVAC unit would take just about a year to come in, whereas before it would be a case of a couple months or even a couple of weeks. So we're seeing these very long, extended lead times for equipment that really is required to build out these spaces. And something that we've seen too, which we haven't seen in the past, is clauses in leases where some groups want longer commitments, right? Where it's going to take longer. So we've seen things like labor shortages being put into force majeure clauses, which, as you know, as an attorney, is not something that historically has been included or considered to be force majeure. So contractors are making sure that they're sort of covering themselves, that they don't find themselves in a bad position when they run into these longer lead times or issues hiring labor.
So it's interesting. You talk about these force majeure clauses. You're talking about spiraling costs. So a lot of these situations, what you land up with is a scenario where you say, this is what you bid for the work. This is how we're going to control costs. These are the limits of what I'm willing to pay. You've seen a lot of companies take that unusual step of saying, I'm not going to stick to the contract. I'd rather lose the work than perform the contract. What is your advice for people you represent, which is the clients that you represent, the tenants, to address these spiraling costs?
Well, I think that as we all know, this is a contracting process, Darshan. So the words matter, and therefore, very careful attention to those details in the contracting process are really important. And I think that, to Dan's point, our clients are focusing on them more because there's so much noise in the public sphere about these issues. That's helping us, and it's giving us additional leverage in getting with owner groups and construction contractors who want the business. And against this backdrop of these supply chain issues and labor problems, we have a commercial real estate environment where the transaction volume is down. So there's motivation on the part of these counterparties to do these deals, and they're going to negotiate this carefully, protect themselves. We're going to get additional collateral to back up those obligations, and whether it's payment and performance bonds, whether it's setoffs in leases where tenants can go and do the work themselves if the landlords don't do it and set off against rent due. Because again, at the end of all this, we have businesses who need the space to operate and thrive.
Right.
And if they don't, if they're delayed in their operations, it often has very substantial economic penalties, and at times can put their businesses at enterprise risk.
Which is very true. But let me ask you this question. I know, Dan, you want to get in on this, but what I almost hear you describe is the problem 2 months ago, in that inflation's through the roof. There's tons of money out there. Everyone's just going, I want this problem solved and I'm willing to pay for it. What I'm seeing now is conversations around contractors saying, I need more work. The work that I had is starting to dry up. Yep. You saw lumber prices that were at all-time highs starting to readjust. So my question for you is, and obviously we're not talking about Biomeme specifically, but let's say you had a situation like Biomeme pop up for you again. Do you think that those spiraling costs would actually work out in your favor now? Because you can now go, well, if it's not you, it's someone else, because I know everyone's starting to look for work again. Or do you think that environment hasn't changed yet? And I'm going to let Dan answer this one first, and then Gary, you can jump in.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that what we have seen is that contractors are willing to get more competitive with their pricing, but with materials pricing being what they are, there's limited room in these contracts for these contractors to make a profit in the first place. Yeah. And the issue with labor shortages is really compounding the effect, where you have rising material costs and rising labor costs. So you can get aggressive with contractors, but they can't make materials arrive on site any faster. So cost-wise, I think there is the ability to sort of drive down costs by competing this against different groups. But material costs are what they are, and lead times are what they are, and it's very difficult to speed this process up. And I think what we've been counseling our clients on is it's important to start these processes as early as practical. And it's not that you want to get ahead of yourself and start a real estate process before you really know what you want and get out over your skis. But it's far easier to slow down a real estate process than it is to speed it up. So the more time a group can give us to try to fulfill their requirement, the better chances you'll have to get the materials on time and have the time to negotiate these contracts to still meet your deadlines.
And by the way, Darshan, because there's so much knowledge floating around again in sort of the public domain on these challenges, landlords are open to starting those conversations earlier. It's in their interest as well to be doing this.
So let me ask you this: are you seeing a slowdown in construction, for example? Let me ask you that question.
Well, one of our truths is one of our other truths, right? Is that
let's go to number 3. It's a great transition, Gary.
Actually, let's do number 3. I believe Gary did number 4. So Dan, what is your number 3?
Well, our number 3 truth is that there's a large gap between what currently exists for these users and what is being proposed or is in the pipeline for these users.
Correct.
So if you are a life sciences user in the market for space today, your options are far different than what they will be if your target date is the end of 2023, or even better, the end of 2024. So there's a lot of proposed projects that are either going into the ground or waiting for a tenant before they go into the ground, but they have long lead times. You don't build these buildings overnight. They take years to plan and build, and there are a lot of things going on. But the question is, what's the snapshot in time look like for when you actually have to meet your requirement? And currently there's a pretty big gap depending on what you're talking about, or when you're talking about, rather.
But then can you retrofit currently existing buildings to meet that gap? Like, what I'm hearing you talk about is building a building, but is there an ability to go, there is, like, let's be honest, a lot of Market Street right now is emptier than it was. And it's empty. And just to be clear for those people who are confused why I just said Market Street, we're all in Philadelphia. Market Street is the main hub, if you will. But Market Street is a little emptier than it was in 2019. Does it make sense for a new company to go, you know what, we're going to retrofit this space to be more life sciences friendly? Or is everyone saying we're talking about the new buildings coming up, those are going to be the hubs, and we'd rather not go into spaces that we probably want to move from? Dan?
Well, I think the Curtis building and 401 North Broad are both very good examples of existing buildings that were retrofitted to be life sciences buildings. You have a number of life sciences users who moved into the Curtis. You have Biome who's moved into 1401. But similarly, you have other buildings in Center City that have put out marketing materials saying that they are life sciences ready, let's call it. The Wanamaker building, One South Broad come to mind. And those are buildings where they have said, yes, we can do this, but they haven't really taken any concrete steps to make that happen, whether it's upgrading the ventilation. They've gone through feasibility studies and said, yes, there is a world where we can do this, but it hasn't actually happened yet. And I think that it's surprisingly expensive to retrofit one of these buildings, and not every building is a good candidate based on the number of stories in the building, ceiling heights, floor loads, ventilation that's currently existing. It's a difficult process. It's the reason
elevator
that you don't,
service, power, the whole thing.
It's the reason that you don't. A lot of people say, well, why don't we take these old office buildings and turn them into multifamily units, right? Just to kind of put a different spin on it.
Yeah.
And it turns out it is shockingly expensive to turn one of these commercial buildings into a multifamily building. And in some cases, it may even be more cost effective to scrape the building and start over again, or at least comparable enough where you could have a conversation about it. So it's not such an easy thing to do.
Gary, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say this too, that the choices that owners are making about whether to retrofit are also affected by the cost and timeline of new construction, right? And so to the extent that there's infrastructure that's very substantial and amenable to conversion, right, it becomes a timeline and cost advantage over a project on which there are marketing materials, no lead user, and they're not in the ground, right? Which is, for a high rise is at least a 30-month process. And we're talking about for buildings where permits are in place, right? And construction contracts are essentially agreed to. It's just a matter of, getting the shovels down in there. So yeah, there are absolute advantages that existing owners have over developers, and they're exercising those advantages every day. As Dan just identified a couple of properties where there's a lot of activity.
So it's funny you say that, because I just saw this in the news, and I'm going to try to share it in a few seconds. But the news is Philadelphia is on the cusp of becoming a top 10 startup ecosystem in the U.S. And it's by Ryan.
It's been all over.
Yeah, exactly. It's been all over. So is this ecosystem ready? One of the key components of being an ecosystem is that you can actually house the ecosystem. So we've already sort of, in the Philadelphia area, we've already made some steps. For example, recently there was a lowering of the employment tax, for example, that makes things a little bit more innovator friendly, if you will, for lack of a better term. But the space itself, what you're telling me is that our buildings at this moment may be ready for an old version or older model. Are we ready to be that top 10 ecosystem, even though there are some struggles?
So I'm gonna fold in our third truth, and by folding in our third truth, we're gonna answer your question.
Okay.
The geography, right, of the options in our region for life sciences generally, pharma in particular, is expanding in a major way. This is not your Uncle John's, Philadelphia science ecosystem. And because that geography is expanding, and it's really expanding in the entire belt between Newark, Delaware, and Princeton, New Jersey, we are friendlier, more adaptable, more accommodating to startups and companies that are emerging from startup to enterprise than any time in the last 30 years. And that's really exciting. Key is, Darshan, is that many of those options are out of downtown Philadelphia. And that's okay, because science is being performed that's great in universities and other settings in those surrounding areas that are generating ideas and evidence-based research that's on the cusp and often commercializing and generating the need for these spaces. It's a good thing.
So what,
I was going to give you an example, about this adaptation, adaptive reuse versus new construction. A perfect example of that is the CRISP campus, right? The Chestnut Run Innovation and Science Park, just in North Wilmington. It was originally part of the Chestnut Run DuPont campus and went through several different iterations of potentially being something else. And a very well capitalized regional developer recently bought it, and they're doing the work to grind out new infrastructure to support this park, and it's really exciting. What is going to be available there later this year, some of which is already available, but it's a phased plan, and that's an example of real estate that is there, ready to support a growing ecosystem in northern Delaware and all over greater Philadelphia for those kind of in those kind of buildings.
So what you just described is that this heading is misleading, in that what I read in that heading is Center City, Philadelphia is on the cusp. And what you're really saying is you need the right guides to point out what Philadelphia means. Philadelphia
Correct.
is not just a 10-block radius or a 30-block radius from City Hall. It's 20 miles or 30 miles from City Hall. And
I think we've got a very large biotechnology center in Warrington in Bucks County that has recently expanded and opened under the direction of Lou Casa, and they're doing amazing work out there. There's activity all around Metro Princeton. There continues to be a very substantial growth of pharma and other life sciences in King of Prussia and west of there along 202. And of course, we've got these nodes of activity all throughout greater Center City that are spectacularly important. Whether we're talking the Navy Yard or University City or North Broad, 401 North Broad Street, in the Independence Mall, submarket where the Curtis is located, it's really exciting. And more choice means, more friendliness for folks who want to operate in different parts of the region. And by the way, those increasing choices provide us more inventory to work with, and therefore, pricing and other leverage that we can drive in competing out these requirements for companies, many of which are very, very careful in how they're using their cash.
Darshan, I think Philadelphia also has a lot of things going for it for all startups, not just life sciences startups, right? For a lot of technology startups, Philadelphia is a very attractive city. We have a number of universities that are pumping out a significant number of high quality graduates, a lot of who are local to Philadelphia and would like to stay in Philadelphia. Despite rising house costs and rising interest rates across the country, Philadelphia remains a very livable city in terms of cost of living compared to some of these other major cities that you would consider to be sort of like a classic tech startup hub like New York or Boston or Austin or San Francisco or Seattle. Philadelphia remains a relatively well-educated and also affordable city. And I think a lot of people are seeing Philadelphia as a logical place to hire people and set up shop and open their companies and invest. On top of that, we have a really strong local group of incubators that have spun out some very impressive startups. Philly Startup Leaders does a really great job the Drexel entrepreneurship program does a great job of sort of facilitating the growth of these companies. So I think real estate aside, Philadelphia has a lot of things going for it that make it attractive for young tech companies.
So what you're pointing to is a few different truths that came out for me. One was looking outside just the central hub of what Philadelphia is. It's also important to realize that these hubs are competing against Philadelphia for market share and for their own tax bases. So going to someone like Tactics, for example, to help guide that process, to find which is the right fit for them, is often because, or you could do it yourself, but it means knowing the ecosystems, knowing where each piece is. Because if you're a biotech, I imagine one location is better than another. If you're a medical device company, one location is better than another. Yes, you could make the 2-hour drive, get from one end of the city or one suburb to another, or you could just talk to someone and go, you need to be in the right space. Here's what the research looks like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But so I want to make sure I have it right. So far I have what your plans will take longer and cost more. What exists versus what's being proposed are two different things. What was your third one again?
The third one is that the geography of options is expanding.
The geography of options is expanding. So we talked about that a little bit. So what's your final and last takeaway?
I'll bring it home for us. And I sort of already touched on this a little bit. And that is that in terms of cost of occupying real estate, Philadelphia remains a relatively low-cost place to set up shop compared to some of these more typical life sciences hubs that we think about around the country. When you're talking about new construction, rents are probably in the $40, $50 to $60 a square foot range on pre-existing things that may be down in the 30s. And those are numbers that are unheard of in places like Boston and San Francisco. I mean, you're talking about rents that are potentially double that, if not more. So when you're thinking about places to set up shop, where the talent is, where we can hire from, but also where's an affordable place to do this that has some inventory, Philadelphia just very quickly finds itself climbing the list.
So that's interesting, right? What you're telling me is,
and by the way, Dan, sorry for interrupting, Darshan. It's maintained its status as a low cost, lower overhead destination for these companies compared to these other very, very well-known centers of pharma and life science activity.
So I guess my question is, we've got super low cost, almost half what a lot of these hubs are charging. You've got multiple universities, a really robust healthcare system, a really innovative life sciences group. Why don't we have more people here? Why are we not cracking the top 10 startup hubs? So what's the downside?
I think this market needs a little bit more time to develop, and especially with what's going on in the world, it's taking longer than people sort of hoped or thought that it would. And I think that if you look at what's happening in University City, if we can fast forward to 2025, the skyline of University City is going to be significantly different than it is today or was 2 years ago. And that's going to be the case as time goes on, and we have time to sort of see these projects through. Penn recently announced a massive expansion of Pennovation, which is going to take 2 to 3 years to come to fruition. But when it does, will be this beautiful new space that will house many of these new companies who are looking to come here either on a temporary short-term basis to prove out their model or on a more long-term basis. And I think everything in real estate takes longer than you hope it will or than you want it to.
And by the way,
we're seeing that play out in real time.
And by the way, Dan, let's also be real. The real estate is supporting businesses that many of which are hyper-regulated and whose underlying business model requires patience, right? I'm thinking, for example, even of the Biomeme deal that we recently did. This is a company that began in an accelerator program in University City, and the founders of which were from New Mexico. They came here to participate in this startup. It was more than 8 years ago. Fast forward ahead, they've had tremendous success in their science. They've commercialized it. they've gone from a workforce of this, right, to 150 people working from 401 North Broad. And there are hundreds of others who are engaged with Biomeme in other markets throughout the country. It takes time. And it's especially unnerving because a lot of capital is coming in from PEs and other outside investors who don't necessarily share that same patience, right? And so where the tread's going to meet the road is the length of the leash in order to prove out the science and to commercialize. And we all know that we're marketing under a mantra of Silicon Valley, that this is a global center of cell and gene therapy, and yet there's so much more going on. And I think where the tread's going to meet the road in creating this larger workforce, this larger ecosystem, is what are we going to graft onto this already really robust and really dynamic and prominent cell and gene therapeutics ecosystem, sub-ecosystem. And we're working on it every day. And the folks in universities and labs are working on it every day.
Which is so cool. Before we go, a couple of things to remind everyone. Gary, how can people reach you?
Well, if they can reach me through you, of course, because you are our global media advisor. If they want to reach me directly, it's Lozoff at tactics.com.
Very cool. And Dan?
You can reach me by email at dritterman@tactics.com. Gary and I are also very active on LinkedIn these days. You can find both of us there. If you like this kind of content and kind of hearing about what's going on in the commercial real estate market in Philadelphia, Gary and I are doing a weekly LinkedIn live show called the R5 Connection, where we talk about sort of happenings in the commercial real estate market in and around Philadelphia. So if you like this sort of thing and you find it interesting, we're always reading all the stories about what's happening. We want to bring some interesting ones to you. So please come check it out.
And where can they find the podcast?
What was that?
Where can they find it?
You can find it on LinkedIn. All the episodes are on LinkedIn under my profile. They called the R5 Connection.
There you go. Gary, parting words from
you. I was going to just say that it's important that I think that we recognize, things that are very important initiatives that are going on affecting the life sciences industry and pharma and certainly our commercial real estate industry around DEI and in particular what's happening for Pride Month this month. It's having an impact every day. These are initiatives that affect what Dan and I are doing, because what we are doing is participating and advising on transactions that are going to create built environments, workspaces that are places of human creativity and collaboration, comfort, safety, security, and that's about achieving that for every worker, right? And we're reminded of that in a very poignant way this month.
But before I let you get off that topic, Gary, I need one thing that I want to remind people of. And you mentioned it before we started talking, which is why I want to pull it in. From a commercial real estate perspective, how does DEI play into the choice of environment? You talk about these built-in environments, and then you actually talk offline, for example, about bathrooms, and you talked about how they can be configured to be more inclusive. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the most obvious one is a gender-neutral bathroom. We've seen a lot of companies install gender-neutral bathrooms, and really just having spaces where people can go and have a little bit of privacy. Unlike these huge open offices that we've been building, that's still the trend that we've seen. But having areas where people can go to be themselves or be by themselves and really get away from the rest of what's going on at the company, and just have a little bit of space that's sort of their me space where they can, feel comfortable and safe.
Very, very cool.
And
So
I mean, it's and you know what, Darshan, the challenge around that is profound now, because there's so much emphasis on communal space, on particularly now that we're dealing with acute challenges, down from C teams and executive committees and in professional services firms, to get people back into the office, engaging with each other and collaborating with each other and socializing with each other. Well, a lot of our built environment, post March of 2020, is about these communal spaces. All the more, and to Dan's point, puts all the, a finer point, more stress on how those environments are going to look that are not public.
Yeah.
Right.
So sort of, I'm going to pull it all home together. There are four key truths that we talked about. It will take longer and cost more. What exists versus what's being proposed are two different things, and the geography of options is expanding, and Philly is a low-cost option to address a lot of these needs. And if you are considering this is Pride Month, a conversation to have is if you're trying to bring your employees back to the office, because that generates and fosters the conversation you want, the engagement that you want, you need to include and consider places that will make employees feel welcomed, that makes employees feel safe. And these need to be considered. It can't be an afterthought that you're trying to retrofit, because as we learned, retrofitting can be a very expensive option. And that might land up taking up more time than you want and more expensive than you want. So thank you, Gary. Thank you, Dan. It was great having you guys on.
Darshan, you crushed the summary. Yep.
Thanks so much, Darshan. We always love chatting with you.